A lot of us probably laughed when the UK made this guy their Prime Minister, then laughed again when they voted for Brexit, and again when they inevitably realised they'd been duped and made a big mistake. A lot of us probably laughed when this guy announced he was running for President of the USA, and then laughed some more when he actually won the election. Well, now the world's looking at us, and they're not laughing. I'm just wondering what the actual...
Crikey dingo!
It would appear that the majority of Australians have proven themselves equally as gullible and susceptible to post-truth campaigning as our friends in the US and the UK.
So there it is. Anthony Green has called it at 7:24 p.m. The Indigenous Voice Referendum has been defeated.
Let's speak plainly. On the weekend, the majority of Australians decided that they did not want to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the Constitution, and they did not want to create a non-binding advisory body. For a majority of Australians, that very simple ask was just too much. The majority of Australians voted to ensure that the status quo was maintained, that the disadvantage experienced by arguably the most marginalised members of our society will remain. I think that's worth reflecting on. No supporters, including Gina Rinehart and God knows who else, but definitely don't call them elites, partied on behind closed doors on Saturday night, enjoying canapes to celebrate the fact that Trump-style campaigning does work in Australia, and that Australia remains the only first world nation with a colonial history that does not recognise its first people in the Constitution. Was I surprised by the result? Nah. Disappointed, but definitely not surprised. There'd been enough polling done in the lead up to this referendum to know where this thing was headed. You can try and deny polling all you like, and many people did try, but the reality is when it's conducted frequently by a variety of companies over an extended period of time, you can be fairly confident it's on the money. So why did the referendum fail? I mean, it's easy to point to the fact that no referendum in Australia has succeeded without bipartisan support, and yeah, this would have played a massive role. And it's true to say that the proposal was enjoying widespread support prior to the opposition throwing their time and money behind the no vote. But does anyone truly believe that bipartisan support was possible on this issue with the coalition in their current state? Remember, Dutton had decided to push the no case even before the parliamentary inquiry into the proposal had kicked off. The National Party had already made their opposition to the voice clear even months before that. You can't fault Albanese for keeping his promise to the Indigenous community. He said he'd deliver the referendum in his first term, and he's delivered. He's ticked that box. But this needed to be more than a box-ticking exercise. The government didn't do a great job of selling the proposal, and did an even worse job of countering the rampant misinformation that was constantly thrown out by the no camp. From the moment the coalition formally stepped out and put their weight behind a no result, the referendum was flooded with misinformation and lies, on a scale we haven't seen before in Australian politics. Misinformation can be hard to counter. Repetition can transform misinformation into fact in the minds of people very quickly, and it often targets ingrained biases people already have. Dutton and his pals were quick to muddy the waters, and in the first few months the yes camp were quite quiet, which allowed the no camp to suck up all the oxygen from the room.
The no campaign was led by Fair Australia's Matt Sheehan and Steve Doyle.
But the big problem, which we discovered and which we suspected, was very few people knew about the referendum. But this was an opportunity, as it gave us a chance to shape the conversation, to talk about things like the Uluru Statement and treaties, all on our terms. A lot of the issues that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and others have been caught up in have been specifically, strategically brought up by Advance.
By the time the yes camp really got moving, it was far too late. Maybe the yes camp went into this expecting a fair fight. When it comes to the rampant misinformation though, the government need to take a certain amount of responsibility here. The Labor government had the opportunity to support the Stop the Lies bill prior to the referendum.
Prime Minister, right now it's perfectly legal for political parties and politicians to lie in advertising for elections and referendums. I tabled my Stop the Lies bill yesterday to stop this. Will the government support regulating against misleading and deceptive advertising in election and referenda advertising to ensure a fact-based, respectful debate on The Voice?
Spoiler alert, the answer was no. Labor sided with the coalition to block the Stop the Lies bill. The timing was bad. No doubt Albo thought that the referendum could ride the wave of goodwill his new government was experiencing by virtue of not being Scott Morrison. This was a mistake. Maybe if the referendum had run in the first 6 months of forming government, it may have been the case. But the timing now though, without bipartisan support, was just bad. Cost of living is top of mind for a majority of the population. The polling will tell us this. When cost of living really started to bite, it's no coincidence that support for the voice began dropping. According to the most recent Resolve poll, one of the most common reasons for voting no was that everyone should be treated the same. Peeling that back, it's hard not to think that this assessment is pretty spot on.
And it's interesting as well, I think, now that we can see that wealthier electorates were more inclined to vote yes. And I think if we really peel back some of the rhetoric that was reasons why people were voting no, underneath it was, what are they getting that I don't have? Yeah. I think that was really what people were saying. Yeah. It's a cost of living crisis, it's a hard time for some people. I don't feel like they should get more than me. I think if we really strip it back, that's what some people were saying.
Could the government have released an exposure draft of the legislation before the referendum? Sure. Do I think it would have made any difference? No. It would only have provided the no case more fuel to spread doubt and misinformation. The no camp was smart in making Jacinta Price their figurehead. She was able to say things that Dutton couldn't.
Do you believe the history of colonisation continues to have an impact on some Indigenous Australians?
No. I'll be honest with you, no, I don't think so. Positive impact, absolutely. I mean, now we've got running water, we've got readily available food. There's no ongoing negative impacts of colonisation.
She was able to tell many people in the community what they were wanting to hear.
We are absolutely not a racist country.
Having two Indigenous people front the no campaign did enough to create doubt that perhaps this wasn't something that the majority of Indigenous people wanted. I guess for quite a few people this was the green light that they were looking for. There was a lot of noise from the no camp in the lead up to the referendum that there was no real support for the voice among Indigenous communities. It's too little and too late, but that lie has quickly been dragged out into the sunlight, despite Senator Price trying to give it another run in her victory speech.
Where it was suggested that 80% of Indigenous Australians supported this proposal when we knew that was not the case. When I knew, having spoken to people throughout the Northern Territory, to Indigenous people from the Northern Territory and right across the country, particularly in my role as the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, that a vast group of Indigenous Australians did not support this proposal. And it has been a shame that throughout the campaign that we have been accused of misleading this country through disinformation and misinformation.
Which is exactly what you did.
It's unfortunate that there will be Australians slowly coming to the realisation that the voice was supported by a majority of Indigenous people, and overwhelmingly supported by those in remote areas, those that stood to gain the most. The support was there, it was always there. Whether it was 60, 70 or 80% by the time the final siren rang, majority support was there. For me, a major mistake of the Yes campaign was the lack of polling of Indigenous communities leading up to the referendum. There are only 3 polls that looked at support for the voice among the Indigenous population, 2 done earlier in the year and 1 dropping in the last week. They all raised questions. Relying on 2 polls from the start of the year was a mistake. Not getting out and polling Indigenous communities in the lead-up was a mistake. Being unable to accurately demonstrate the level of Indigenous support for the voice was a weakness of the campaign. The reasons given for voting no have generally always been flimsy at best.
I don't understand it. They already have enough privileges and money spent on them. They don't appreciate it. This is discriminatory by definition, and I'm against racism. Everyone should be treated the same. Many Aboriginal people are saying no to this, so why should other people support it? Aboriginal people already have the same voice as everyone else in Parliament.
The fact that these are reasons people have given for voting no is both a failure of the Yes campaign and a triumph of the misinformation and blatant lies brought to the table by the no camp. As much as people might want to deny it, there was an undercurrent of racism beneath many of the no votes. To try and deny that would be denying reality. You could see this in the way that many attempted to justify their reasoning for voting no, but when you peeled back the layers of the onion, it was there. There was a mantra I'd seen shared often on social media that said something to the effect of, "Not all no voters are racist, but all racists will vote no." I think that probably rings fairly true. Sean Kelly, writing for The Age, summed it up a lot better than I can. "I've been struck by the widespread conclusion based on polling that Australians were persuaded by the argument that the voice would divide the country. Voters may well say this was what persuaded them, but it is likely that most were instinctively against the idea. Of the reasons they were able to choose between to justify their choice, this one sounded most attractive. Understandably, it enabled people to preserve their good opinion of themselves. They were not voting from racial prejudice. Dear me, no, it was the opposite. They were voting against Indigenous Australians because they hated racism. We are a country that does not know itself. I'm sure Dutton and co will do their best to lay blame for the referendum's failure at the feet of Albo, because after all, that was their real reason for opposing it in the first place. They were just trying to take some skin off the government and weaken them heading toward 2025. Ironically though, this could have the opposite effect for Dutton. It's no real surprise that the Teal seats all seem to have backed the Voice, and it's unlikely that the people within those electorates will forget Dutton's stance or the methods deployed to get the no result over the line. So what are the Coalition's big plans for addressing the issues now they've successfully sunk the referendum? Well, they want an audit of where the money has gone, which will be interesting given they were in government for close to 10 years. And Dutton has found an Indigenous voice he's actually willing to listen to. Other than that, not much. Here's a fact people may find uncomfortable. Education was the biggest indicator of how a particular electorate or community might vote. Of the seats to have voted yes, all were among the top third in the country in terms of education attainment. Thanks to the pandemic, we're starting to see a body of research emerging that would indicate that there's a relationship between a person's susceptibility to misinformation and their education level. The higher the level of education, the less likely someone is to swallow misinformation. This referendum should serve as a warning to the government. If they don't pony up and put a stop to the misinformation in political campaigning, by the time 2025 rolls around, we can expect to see an election campaign that might even make Donald Trump blush.